Turner, we've installed a temporary safety barrier at your property entrance. Fully within HOA authority, I assure you.
You blocked my driveway because of a rooster.
She didn't flinch, just opened her clipboard, turned a page, and looked at me the way a DMV employee looks at someone who forgot a form. Patient, practiced, and completely unmoved. I nodded, walked back inside, pulled open the kitchen drawer, and found a piece of paper from 1978 that Karen Whitmore had no idea existed. One that was about to make everything she'd just done the most expensive mistake of her HOA presidency. She came to my gate thinking she had all the power. She hadn't read the fine print. Have you ever watched someone make a move so confident, so certain, right before you realized they'd just handed you exactly what you needed? My name is Jake Turner. I'm 45 years old, and I've lived on this land my entire life. 30 acres just outside Austin, Texas. Not a hobby farm, not a weekend retreat, a working ranch that my father built from dirt and stubbornness, and that I've kept running the same way, quietly, steadily, without asking anyone for permission. We have cattle, not many, maybe 18 head, but enough to remind you every morning that something alive depends on you showing up. We have a barn that's been standing since 1987. Its red paint faded to something closer to rust now, but the frame is solid. We have fence lines I've walked so many times I could do it blind. And we have one rooster, a big, unhurried bird named nothing in particular, who crows at sunrise the same way the sun rises, whether you like it or not. This land sat here long before Sunset Hills existed. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. 3 years ago, the field on the other side of my eastern fence was just a field, dry grass, a few live oaks, the occasional deer cutting through at dusk. Then, one spring, the surveying trucks showed up. Then the earth movers. Then, faster than felt possible, a whole neighborhood materialized out of the limestone and cedar. 42 homes with identical mailboxes, identical driveways, and lawns so aggressively maintained they looked less like grass and more like a statement of intent. They called it Sunset Hills. The brochure, which someone once actually handed me at a county meeting, described it as a master-planned community designed for modern families who value order, aesthetics, and quality of life. I read that twice. Looked out at my cattle, looked back at the brochure, filed it in the recycling bin. The first few months were fine. A few new neighbors walked over to introduce themselves. Nice enough people, mostly. Young families, retirees, a couple of remote workers who'd fled Austin proper for something quieter. I didn't mind them. They didn't mind me. The rooster crowed. The cattle moved. The tractor ran on Tuesday mornings. Life continued the way it had for decades. Then, the HOA got its first elected president. Karen Whitmore moved into Sunset Hills 14 months ago. She's somewhere in her mid-50s, always dressed like she has a meeting to get to, and she carries that clipboard the way some people carry a badge, not as a tool, but as a signal. A signal that she is the one who decides what belongs and what doesn't. I didn't know any of that yet when the first email arrived. Subject line, all caps, urgent, aggressive rooster behavior. I read it at the kitchen table with my morning coffee. Then I looked out the window at the rooster, who was standing completely still in the yard, staring at a fence post with the focused intensity of a philosopher contemplating the void. Aggressive, I said out loud, to no one. I deleted the email and went back to my coffee. That was my first mistake, assuming it would stop there. I'm not a complicated man. I don't have a lot of rules I live by, but the ones I have, I keep. Don't start trouble. Don't borrow what you can't return. Don't make your problem someone else's problem. And if a disagreement needs settling, settle it quietly, face to face, like two adults who both have somewhere else to be. My father was the same way. He used to say that a man who goes looking for a fight has already lost something important. Not the fight, but the part of himself that used to know better. I heard that enough times growing up that it stopped being advice and started being instinct. So when the emails kept coming, I didn't escalate. The second one arrived 4 days after the first. Subject: ongoing noise disturbance, rooster activity pre-dawn. I read it, noted that Karen had apparently been awake before sunrise specifically to document the crowing, and chose not to respond. The third came a week later. Subject: cattle visibility and perceived intimidation factor. I had to read that one twice. Then I walked out to the fence line, looked at my cattle, and tried to identify which one looked intimidating. The closest candidate was a 7-year-old Hereford named Biscuit who had a habit of falling asleep standing up. I didn't respond to that one either. The fourth email arrived on a Tuesday, and this one had a new subject line that genuinely stopped me mid-sip. Farm equipment aesthetics, inconsistency with community visual standards. I set my coffee down. My tractor is a 1994 John Deere. It's green. It works. It has never, in 31 years of operation, been asked to meet anyone's visual standards, and I was not prepared to start that conversation now. But I still didn't respond. Not because I was afraid, not because I thought she was right, but because I've lived long enough to know that some people aren't looking for a resolution. They're looking for a reaction. They want you rattled. They want you on the defensive. They want the argument to start on their terms, in their language, in the arena they've already set up. And I had no interest in walking into that arena. What I've noticed over the years is that people who are obsessed with controlling small things rarely have the patience to think 3 moves ahead. They're too busy enjoying the power of the move they're on. That's usually their problem right there. When someone turns a minor irritation into a formal campaign, at what point does it stop being about the issue and start being about something they need that has nothing to do with you? Here's what Karen Whitmore was actually coming after, even if she never said it in those words. This land has been in my family for 51 years. My father bought it in 1973 for a price that would make a modern realtor laugh, worked it through 3 droughts, 2 recessions, and 1 exceptionally bad hailstorm that took the barn roof clean off and required 6 weeks of repair he did almost entirely himself. When he passed 11 years ago, he left it to me with 1 instruction, delivered not in a will, but in the kitchen, 2 months before the end, when he was still clear enough to mean it. Don't let anyone tell you this place doesn't belong here. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count. The 30 acres aren't worth a fortune. Not by Austin real estate standards, not anymore. Not with the way land values have moved since the tech money started flowing west. But that's not the point. The point is that this land sits exactly where it has always sat, doing exactly what it has always done. And it was doing it decades before a single slab was poured in Sunset Hills. The ranch has a working rhythm. Cattle fed at 6:30, fence checks on Mondays. Tractor runs on Tuesday and Friday mornings. The old John Deere, loud as it is, because it works and because buying a new one isn't something I'm doing until this one dies, which, judging by its current condition, may be never. The rooster crows at sunrise. That is not a malfunction. That is a rooster. What Karen was threatening, through the emails, through the visits, through the growing stack of HOA correspondence that was beginning to pile up on my kitchen table like an unwanted subscription, wasn't just my right to run a ranch. It was the right to continue existing on land my family had earned, maintained, and never abandoned, on terms that belonged to us and not to a homeowners association that had been incorporated 14 months ago by people who chose to build next to a farm and then seemed genuinely surprised that a farm was there. The tractor didn't move into their neighborhood. They moved next to mine. And that distinction, that simple, obvious, well-documented fact, was something Karen Whitmore had apparently decided was no longer relevant. What she didn't know was that I had paperwork going back further than her neighborhood's concrete foundations. Quiet paperwork, unassuming paperwork, the kind that sits in a kitchen drawer for decades and says nothing until someone gives it a reason to speak. The emails had been annoying, the personal visit had been unwelcome, but I still classified both as the kind of low-grade friction that comes with having new neighbors who haven't yet figured out where their authority ends and someone else's property begins. Then Karen Whitmore showed up with a measuring tape. It It was a Wednesday morning, early enough that the dew was still on the grass. I was coming out of the barn when I saw her, standing at the fence line that separates my property from the Sunset Hills perimeter, dressed like she had a 9 o'clock appointment, holding a bright yellow measuring tape that she was using to record the exact height of my pasture grass on the other side of the fence. My grass, on my property, which she was measuring from her side of the fence with the focused intensity of a forensic investigator. I stood there for a moment and watched. She hadn't seen me yet. She was fully committed to the task, crouching slightly, extending the tape, mouthing numbers to herself, writing them onto her clipboard with the deliberate care of someone documenting evidence for trial. I walked over slowly. "Morning," I said. She straightened up immediately, not startled exactly, but recalibrating, the way someone looks when they were hoping not to be observed doing the thing they're currently doing. "Mr. Turner," she smiled, the same practiced smile from the first visit. "I was just conducting a routine visual assessment of the boundary conditions." "You were measuring my grass," I said. "I was documenting a potential aesthetic compliance issue," she said, and tapped her clipboard twice with her pen for emphasis. "Under Section 4, Paragraph C of the Sunset Hills Community Standards and Beautification Ordinance." I looked at the grass she'd been measuring. It was pasture grass, on a cattle ranch. Its entire purpose was to be tall enough for cattle to eat, which it was performing admirably. "That's grazing grass," I said, "for the cattle, which is visible from the community green space," she said, "and therefore subject to aesthetic review." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her for a moment, then looked at the cattle, then looked back at her. "Have a good morning," I said, and walked back to the barn. But something had shifted. This wasn't friction anymore. This was a pattern, and patterns, in my experience, don't stop on their own. They accelerate. I started paying closer attention. How much time does a person have to have on their hands, and how little must be actually going wrong in their life to spend a Wednesday morning measuring someone else's grass with a tape measure? 3 days after the measuring tape incident, a certified letter arrived from the Sunset Hills HOA. I signed for it at the door, took it to the kitchen table, and opened it with the same energy I'd give a utility bill. It was 4 pages long, 4 pages single-spaced with a header that read, "Formal Notice of Community Standards Violation. Urgent remediation required." I set it down, made coffee, then came back and read it properly. The violations listed were as follows. 1. Unpermitted agricultural noise generation, specifically rooster vocalization occurring between the hours of 5 a.m. and 7 a.m. in violation of Sunset Hills Quiet Enjoyment Standards, Section 2, Paragraph A. 2. Grazing livestock creating sustained visual disruption to community green space sightlines, constituting an aesthetic hazard under Section 4, Paragraph C. 3. Operation of heavy agricultural equipment during peak residential morning hours, specifically 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. Tuesday and Friday, in violation of Community Tranquility Preservation Guidelines, Section 7. 4. And this was the one that made me put my coffee cup down. Presence of free-range poultry exhibiting unpredictable movement patterns within visible range of community recreational areas, creating reasonable apprehension among residents. Reasonable apprehension. From a rooster. I read that line 3 times. Then I looked out the window at the rooster, who was at that moment standing completely motionless in the yard, staring at nothing, doing absolutely nothing that could be described by any living person as threatening. Now, I want to be honest about what went through my mind in that moment. I could have responded hard. I had every right to. My property predated their HOA by decades. My rooster predated their neighborhood by years. The tractor had been running that Tuesday-Friday schedule since before Karen Whitmore knew this county existed. A good attorney would have looked at this letter, smiled, and had a very productive afternoon. I chose not to do that. Not yet. Partly because I'm not the kind of man who leads with lawyers. Partly because I wanted to see how far she was actually willing to take this before she realized what she was walking into. And partly, if I'm being completely honest, because something about the phrase reasonable apprehension among residents applied to a stationary bird made me want to see what the next letter would say. I folded the notice in half, slid it behind the coffee maker, and went out to feed the cattle. The rooster crowed once as I crossed the yard, right on schedule. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched. Karen Whitmore was not a woman who did things halfway, I'll give her that. Whatever she decided was worth her attention received the full weight of it, organized, documented, and followed up on with the kind of consistency most people reserve for things that actually matter. She drove past my fence line 4 times in 1 week. I know because I counted. Same white SUV, same slow roll, same pause at the eastern corner where the cattle tend to graze closest to the boundary. Twice, she stopped and took photographs from the car window. Once, she got out with the clipboard. The rooster, for his part, remained indifferent to all of it. A second certified letter arrived on a Thursday. This one was shorter, only 2 pages, but it introduced a new phrase I hadn't seen in the first one. Escalating pattern of non-compliance. I hadn't responded to a single letter. I hadn't changed a single thing about how I ran my ranch. Apparently, in Karen's framework, the absence of a response counted as escalation. I filed it behind the coffee maker with the first one. What I was beginning to understand was that this wasn't really about the rooster. It wasn't about the grass height, or the tractor schedule, or the cattle sight lines. Those were the listed items, yes, but they were symptoms of something else entirely. Karen Whitmore had built something in Sunset Hills, a reputation, a role, an identity tied directly to being the person who maintained standards. And my ranch, sitting right there on the other side of the fence, existing exactly as it had always existed, represented something she couldn't file, couldn't fine, and couldn't make conform. It bothered her in a way that had nothing to do with noise ordinances. And here was the thing I'd learned from 45 years of dealing with livestock, land, and the occasional difficult person. When someone is that committed to a problem that isn't really a problem, they're not going to stop at letters. They're going to do something. I just needed to be ready when they did. Have you ever watched someone work themselves into a full escalation over something that only exists as a problem inside their own head, and realized the only move was to stay completely still and let them keep going? I'm not a man who acts without information, so while Karen was out there measuring grass and photographing cattle and composing certified letters about rooster vocalization, I was doing something considerably quieter. I was reading. It started with the HOA's own documents. Sunset Hills had a public-facing website, and buried 3 clicks deep was a full PDF of their community standards and governance charter, 71 pages, last revised 8 months ago, formatted with the solemn gravity of a congressional bill. I printed the whole thing on a Saturday morning and read it at the kitchen table with a red pen and a second cup of coffee. What I found was instructive. The HOA had genuine authority over properties within the Sunset Hills subdivision boundary. Fines, compliance notices, architectural review, all of it was real and legally structured. Karen wasn't making up her power. Within the lines of that subdivision, she had actual tools, and she knew how to use them. The critical word, however, was within. My property was not within Sunset Hills. My fence line was the boundary. Everything on my side of that fence existed entirely outside their jurisdiction, a fact that was plainly stated in the county property records, which I pulled up next and printed on a second stack of papers that joined the first on the kitchen table. I also made a phone call to a property attorney I'd used once before, a straightforward man named Dale who charged reasonable rates and had no patience for unnecessary complexity. I described the situation in about 4 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. "They have zero authority over your land," he said. "Zero. If they fine you for anything occurring on your property, the fine is unenforceable. If they physically interfere with your property access, that's a different conversation entirely." I thanked him and hung up. Then I did one more thing. I went to the barn, found the old filing cabinet my father had kept against the back wall, the one I hadn't opened in years, and started going through it. Land surveys, boundary agreements, county filings going back to 1973. Most of it was exactly what I expected, but near the bottom of the third drawer, in a manila folder labeled simply Entrance 1978, I found something I hadn't thought about in a very long time. I took it to the kitchen, read it slowly, read it again. Then I set it on the counter, separate from everything else, and looked at it for a while. I didn't call Dale back that day. I just made a note of a small, unremarkable piece of land sitting at the very entrance of Sunset Hills, a parcel so minor, so easy to overlook, that it had almost certainly never appeared on Karen Whitmore's clipboard. Almost certainly. I didn't respond to the letters. I didn't call the HOA office. I didn't show up at their board meeting. I didn't post anything online. I didn't ask my neighbors what they'd heard. I ran the ranch exactly as I always had. Cattle fed at 6:30, tractor on Tuesday and Friday, rooster crowing at whatever hour the rooster decided was appropriate. To Karen Whitmore, my silence read as surrender. I know this because of what happened next. Within 4 days of my continued non-response, the HOA website updated its community bulletin board with a new post, authored by Karen herself, titled Progress Update, Agricultural Compliance Initiative. I found it because a neighbor 2 miles down the road sent me a screenshot with a text that just said, "You seeing this?" The post was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph described the HOA's ongoing efforts to preserve the integrity and visual harmony of the Sunset Hills living experience. The second paragraph referenced persistent non-compliance from an adjacent agricultural property and assured residents that formal remediation procedures were actively underway. The third paragraph, and this was the part that told me everything I needed to know about where Karen's head was, thanked the community for their patience and closed with the line, "Rest assured, your HOA board is handling this matter with the full weight of its authority." Full weight of its authority. For a rooster. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Dale with a single line, "Keeping you updated." He replied 20 minutes later, "Let her keep going." So I did. What I understood, reading that post, was that Karen had interpreted my silence as weakness, and weakness, for someone built the way she was built, was an invitation. Not to negotiate, not to find a reasonable middle ground, but to push further, establish dominance more completely, and make sure everyone in the subdivision knew she was the one who had handled it. She wasn't solving a problem anymore. She was performing. And the audience she'd chosen, 42 households, a community Facebook group, and a bulletin board that updated twice a week, was watching, which meant that whatever she did next, she'd do it publicly, and whatever came back at her would land publicly too. I went back to the barn filing cabinet that evening, pulled out the 1978 folder again, set it on the kitchen counter where I could see it from the table, just leaving it there, waiting the way patient things wait. The Facebook Live happened on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I'd just finished the morning tractor run, the usual circuit along the western fence line, nothing dramatic, same route I'd done 100 times, when my phone started buzzing with notifications from people tagging me in a video. I parked the tractor, pulled out my phone, and pressed play. Karen Whitmore was standing at the corner of her subdivision's community green space, which put her approximately 40 feet from my fence line, with her phone held at the precise angle of someone who has watched enough news broadcasts to know where to position the camera. She was dressed for it, not casually, not like someone who'd just stepped outside. Blazer, sunglasses, the clipboard visible under her left arm like a prop she'd remembered to bring. She spoke for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the whole thing, sitting on my tractor, eating the last of a sandwich I'd brought from the house. The highlights in order. She opened by describing my ranch as an ongoing quality-of-life crisis affecting the families of Sunset Hills. She then walked through what she called a documented pattern of agricultural aggression, a phrase she used twice without apparent irony, which included the rooster, the cattle, the tractor schedule, and, in a new addition I hadn't seen in the letters, the persistent odor of livestock waste drifting into residential airspace. She held up a printed photograph of my pasture. It was a photograph of grass and cows, which is what a pasture looks like, but she presented it with the gravity of someone unveiling satellite imagery of a weapons facility. Then she said the thing that made 3 separate neighbors text me within 60 seconds of each other. "I want to be very clear," Karen said, looking directly into the camera. "We are not anti-farming. We are not against agriculture as a concept. We are simply against this kind of farming, the kind that disregards its neighbors, the kind that treats a community of families as an inconvenience, the kind that," she paused for effect, "frankly, has no place next to a modern residential development." I set my phone down on the tractor dashboard, looked out at the pasture, looked at Biscuit the Hereford, who was lying down in the sun with the unhurried serenity of an animal that has never once considered whether it belonged somewhere. Then I picked my phone back up, opened my contacts, and called Dale. "She just did a Facebook Live," I said. "I saw," he said. "Someone sent it to me. She said my ranch has no place next to a modern residential development." There was a pause. "Jake," Dale said, "your family's been on that land since 1973. "I know." "Her neighborhood was built in 2021. "I know." Another pause. Then, "You ready to make a move?" I thought about the 1978 folder sitting on my kitchen counter. "Not yet," I said, "but soon." When someone stands in front of a camera and tells the world that your family's land that existed decades before their neighborhood was even a blueprint, has no place there anymore, what exactly are they revealing about themselves? 7 days after the Facebook Live, Karen Whitmore stopped working alone. The first sign was a county code enforcement truck parked outside my gate on a Wednesday morning. The officer, a young guy, polite, clearly uncomfortable, explained that the HOA had filed a formal complaint with the county, citing potential zoning violations related to commercial agricultural activity in proximity to a designated residential zone. I showed him my property classification documents. He looked at them, looked at his clipboard, looked back at me. "Sir, your land is zoned agricultural," he said. "Has been since before I was born, looks like." "Since 1971, I said. He wrote something in his notebook, thanked me for my time, and left. I watched his truck pull away and thought, that was round 1. There would be more. There were more. Within the same week, a certified letter arrived from a law firm I'd never heard of. 2 attorneys representing the Sunset Hills HOA board, informing me that the association was exploring all available legal remedies regarding what they now termed the ongoing nuisance created by adjacent agricultural operations. The letter was 4 pages and contained 17 uses of the word "herein." Dale read it and told me it was largely performative, expensive stationery around a very thin legal argument, but that I should keep it. I kept everything. Then came the HOA emergency board meeting. Karen announced it on the community bulletin board with 48 hours notice. Urgent community meeting, agricultural impact on Sunset Hills quality of life. Thursday evening, 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. Residents were encouraged to attend and make their voices heard. I wasn't invited. I wasn't a resident. But I heard about what happened inside from 3 different people who were there, and their accounts were consistent enough that I'm confident in the picture. Karen had prepared a presentation, not notes, not a handout, a full slideshow, 14 slides projected on the clubhouse wall, titled, and I am quoting this accurately because someone photographed it and sent me the image, "Sunset Hills Under Siege, a data-driven assessment of agricultural encroachment." Slide 3 contained an annotated aerial photograph of my property with labeled arrows identifying the barn, the cattle pasture, the tractor path, and I want you to understand that this was a real slide in a real presentation shown to real adults. A separate arrow pointing to a small shape near the fence line labeled Rooster, Known Aggressor. Slide 7 was a bar graph. The bar graph purported to show the decline in community wellness scores, a metric Karen had apparently invented and self-reported through a neighborhood survey she had also designed, over the 6 months since she had begun documenting my ranch. Slide 11 proposed 3 remediation pathways, the most aggressive of which suggested the HOA pursue a formal petition to rezone my property. Rezone a 51-year-old agricultural property because of a rooster. By all accounts, the room was not uniformly supportive. Several residents asked questions Karen hadn't prepared for, whether the HOA had the legal standing to pursue rezoning, what the estimated legal costs would be, and whether this was really the best use of association dues. One man, apparently, raised his hand and asked if anyone had simply tried talking to me. Karen explained that she had attempted multiple formal outreach efforts, which was technically true if you counted certified letters written by attorneys as outreach, and that I had been unresponsive to the remediation process. The meeting ended without a formal vote on any of the proposed pathways, but the law firm sent another letter the following Monday, and the week after that, a contractor appeared at the entrance of Sunset Hills to install a new automated gate system, one that Karen announced in a bulletin board post would enhance community security and help manage the boundary between residential and non-residential land uses. The gate went up on a Friday. I watched it from my truck on the road, engine idling. It was a solid gate, heavy, electronic, the kind that needs a key fob or a code to operate. I drove home, pulled out the 1978 folder from the kitchen counter, and read it one more time, slowly, all the way to the end. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dale. The second was to a real estate agent named Patricia, who specialized in small rural land parcels and had an office 20 minutes outside of Austin. "Patricia," I said, "I need to buy a piece of land. It's small, it's not worth much, but I need it quickly, and I need the transaction done quietly." She found it in 4 days. How many resources, legal fees, contractor costs, community meetings, 14-slide PowerPoint presentations does a person burn through before they stop and ask whether the problem they're solving was ever real to begin with? Not everyone in Sunset Hills was Karen Whitmore. I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to paint the whole neighborhood with the same brush, and that wouldn't be accurate or fair. Most of the 42 households were ordinary people who had bought a house in a new development because they wanted a yard and a decent school district, and maybe a little breathing room from the city. They hadn't moved there to wage war on a cattle ranch. They'd moved there to grill on weekends and watch their kids ride bikes in the cul-de-sac. Several of them had, at various points, quietly made that known to me. There was a man named Greg who lived in the house closest to my eastern fence, close enough that he could hear the rooster clearly every morning, who had stopped me at the gas station 2 months into the whole ordeal and said, unprompted, "For what it's worth, Jake, I don't have a problem with any of it. Knew there was a farm here when we bought the house." There was a woman named Deborah, 3 streets in, who had sent me an actual handwritten note, the only piece of mail I'd received in connection with this situation that didn't have a law firm's return address, that said simply, "This has gone too far. I'm sorry." And there was a retired school teacher named Howard who had attended the emergency board meeting, asked the question about whether anyone had simply tried talking to me, and then, according to 2 separate accounts, quietly said to the person sitting next to him as Karen moved to the next slide, "This is embarrassing." But none of them stood up at the meeting. None of them responded publicly to the bulletin board posts. None of them pushed back on the Facebook Live. None of them called the HOA office and said, officially, on the record, "This is too much." I didn't blame them entirely. HOA politics have a particular social gravity. Once someone has established themselves as the person who enforces the rules, challenging them requires a willingness to become the next target. Most people calculate that risk and decide their mailbox isn't painted the wrong color yet. So they stayed quiet, watched, waited. They were waiting, I think, for something to change the math. How many people in any given situation can see clearly that something has gone wrong, but stay silent anyway because the cost of speaking up feels higher than the cost of watching it continue? The metal barrier appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. I came home from a supply run into town, feed bags, fence wire, nothing dramatic, and found it blocking my driveway completely. Not partially, not symbolically, fully across the entrance, bolted into temporary concrete footings on either side, with a bright orange sign zip-tied to the center bar that read in bold black letters, HOA Temporary Safety Installation, Authorized Personnel Only. I sat in my truck for a moment with the engine running. Then I turned it off, got out, and walked up to it. It was a real barrier. The kind used at construction sites, heavy steel, serious hardware, not something you move with your hands. Whoever Karen had hired to install it had done the job properly, which I'll admit I hadn't expected. I tried the latch, locked. I checked the footings, solid. I took out my phone and photographed it from 4 angles. Then I photographed the sign. Then I photographed the bolt hardware, the concrete footings, and the exact placement relative to my property line marker, which was a survey stake that had been in the ground since 1974 and was clearly visible 6 inches to the right of the barrier's left footing. Then I called Dale. He picked up on the second ring. "She put a barrier across my driveway," I said. A pause that lasted exactly long enough for Dale to process what he'd just heard. "She physically blocked access to your property," he said. "Bolted into the ground," I said. "Concrete footings." Another pause. When Dale spoke again, his voice had the particular quality of a man who has just watched someone hand him a gift he wasn't expecting. "Jake, that's not a fine. That's not a letter. That's not a slideshow about rooster aggression." A beat. "That is a physical obstruction of access to private property. That is a completely different legal category." "I know," I said. "You have photos?" 4 angles. "Don't touch it," he said immediately. "Don't move it. Don't damage it. Don't engage with anyone about it. Just document it and let me make some calls." I looked at the barrier one more time, then at my driveway behind it, then at my house, visible at the end of the drive, exactly where it had stood for 51 years. "Take your time," I said. "I've got somewhere else to be." I drove to Patricia's office, the small parcel at the entrance of Sunset Hills, the one buried in the 1978 agreement, the one nobody had looked at in decades, the one that sat quiet and unremarkable at the exact spot where every single resident drove in and out every single day, was still available. The price was modest. The transaction was straightforward. I signed the paperwork that afternoon. Patricia slid the deed across the desk, and I looked at it for a moment before picking it up. "What are you planning to do with it?" she asked. "Nothing dramatic," I said. "Just needed to make sure it belonged to the right person." I drove home the long way. The barrier was still across my driveway when I got back, orange sign and all, catching the last of the afternoon light like it was proud of itself. I parked on the shoulder, walked to the barn through the side gate, fed the cattle, and went inside. The 1978 folder was still on the counter. I put the new deed next to it. 2 pieces of paper, one from 50 years ago, one from this afternoon. Between them, everything Karen Whitmore had spent the last several months building was about to become significantly more complicated than a rooster. There's a particular kind of silence that isn't weakness, it's preparation. Did you ever watch someone keep pushing, keep escalating, keep adding weight to a structure, not knowing the foundation under them had already shifted? The 1978 agreement was not complicated. That was the thing about it. It wasn't buried in legal language or obscured by decades of amendments. It was 4 pages, typed on paper that had gone the color of weak tea, signed by 2 men whose names I recognized, one of them my father's, one of them the original developer of the land that would eventually become, 43 years later, Sunset Hills. The agreement concerned a small parcel, approximately 0.3 acres, sitting at the entrance of what was then an undeveloped tract, positioned precisely at the point where the private access road met the county road. In 1978, my father had allowed the developer's surveying crews to cross his land during the initial site assessment. In exchange, the developer had granted my father's family a specific and permanent right regarding that entrance parcel. One sentence, page 3, second paragraph. The owner of Parcel 7C retains exclusive operational control over subdivision gate access infrastructure installed on or adjacent to said parcel, in perpetuity, transferable with land ownership. Exclusive operational control, in perpetuity. I'd shown it to Dale the morning after I bought Parcel 7C, driving to his office with both documents, the 1978 agreement and the fresh deed, in a manila folder on the passenger seat. He read the agreement at his desk without speaking, read the relevant sentence twice, looked at the deed, looked back at the sentence. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way people do when they're deciding how to say something accurately without overstating it. "Jake," he said, "do you understand what this means in the context of the gate Karen just installed?" "I have a theory," I said. "The automated gate system she put in, the one she announced as a community security enhancement. She installed it on and adjacent to Parcel 7C. He tapped the deed, which you now own. He tapped the agreement, which this document says gives you exclusive operational control over gate access infrastructure on that parcel." I nodded. "She installed a gate," Dale said slowly, "on land that, per a 50-year-old binding agreement, gives you the right to control it." "That's my theory, too," I said. Dale was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, a truck went by on the county road, and the sound of it faded before either of us spoke again. "The gate has a master key override," he said. "Physical brass key, standard for these systems. Comes with the installation." "I know," I said. "The installer would have provided that key to whoever commissioned the installation." "Karen," I said. "Karen," he agreed. "But legally, operational control of that gate belongs to the owner of that parcel." He looked at me. "Which is you." I let that sit for a second. "I'm going to need a copy of this agreement sent to the gate installation company," I said, "with the deed attached." "Already drafting it," Dale said. The installation company, it turned out, was a straightforward outfit that had no particular interest in being caught in the middle of a property rights dispute. When Dale's letter arrived, politely worded, legally precise, accompanied by both documents, they responded within 48 hours. They sent me a brass key, standard cut, unremarkable, the kind of key you could buy at any hardware store if you knew the code. I held it in my palm for a moment in the parking lot of Dale's office, turning it over once. Then I put it in my shirt pocket, drove home, and hung it on a hook by the kitchen door. I didn't tell Karen. I didn't post anything online. I didn't call the HOA. I just waited for the right moment, which, as it happened, was already scheduled. Thursday, 6:30 p.m., the HOA's next general community meeting, the one Karen had announced with the subject line, "Agricultural Compliance, Path Forward, Rush Hour, over 100 cars coming home." When the thing that was meant to lock you out turns out to be the very thing that hands you control, does that feel like luck? Or does it feel like the natural result of someone overreaching so far they looped all the way back around to your side? The barrier across my driveway stayed up for 6 days. 6 days of parking on the shoulder of the road and walking to my own front door. 6 days of hauling feed bags through the side gate by hand because the tractor couldn't get through. 6 days of my cattle watching me make the extra trip around the fence line with the particular blank expression cattle have that somehow still manages to communicate judgment. On day 3, Karen posted another bulletin board update. Community safety update. Boundary infrastructure now active. The post was brief, 4 sentences, but the tone was unmistakable. She described the barrier installation as a significant step forward in establishing clear boundaries between residential and agricultural land uses. and thanked the board for their decisive action in the face of prolonged non-compliance. Decisive action. I read it sitting on the tailgate of my truck, having just finished carrying a 50-pound feed bag through the side gate in the August heat. I took a photo of the post, sent it to Dale with no comment. He replied, "Good, let her enjoy it." So I did. Day 4. Someone from the Sunset Hills Facebook group, not Karen, a resident named Todd who seemed to genuinely believe he was being helpful, posted a public comment suggesting that perhaps the situation had reached a natural resolution and that both sides might benefit from accepting the new normal. The new normal being, apparently, me parking on the road shoulder and carrying feed bags by hand across my own property. 14 people liked Todd's comment. I read it, closed the app, went back to work. What I want to be honest about is this. Those 6 days were genuinely unpleasant. Not devastating, not life-altering, but real. The extra labor added time to every morning. The parking situation was inconvenient in a way that accumulated. One evening, a delivery truck couldn't reach my door and left a package at the county road, and I didn't find it until the following afternoon because I hadn't thought to check there. Small things, but real things. And I think that's what Karen had calculated on, that the accumulated inconvenience would eventually outweigh whatever resistance I had left, and I would come to the HOA office, hat in hand, ready to negotiate on her terms. That the barrier wasn't just a physical obstruction, it was a psychological one. A daily reminder every time I parked on that shoulder of who had the power to make my life harder. She was right that it was unpleasant. She was wrong about what I would do about it. On day 5, the HOA bulletin board updated again with the agenda for Thursday's general community meeting. The first item, listed in bold, Agricultural Compliance, Path Forward, presentation by HOA President Kay Whitmore. I read that line 3 times. Then I looked at the brass key hanging on the hook by the kitchen door. Thursday, 6:30 p.m., rush hour. Over 100 residents driving home through the one entrance Sunset Hills had, the entrance that sat on Parcel 7C, the parcel whose gate access I now controlled per a 50-year-old binding agreement that Karen had never known existed until Dale's letter landed on the installation company's desk. Karen had spent 6 months building toward Thursday's meeting. She had the slides ready. She had the agenda set. She had the narrative prepared. The decisive HOA president who had finally brought an unruly neighbor into compliance, standing before her community to present the path forward. She had planned everything, except the key. What does it cost a person, not in money, but in something harder to replace, to spend months building a version of events where they're the hero, only to discover the story was never theirs to tell? My father bought this land because he wanted to build something that would outlast him. Not a legacy in the grand sense. He wasn't that kind of man. He didn't talk about leaving a mark or being remembered. He just believed, quietly and completely, that if you worked a piece of ground long enough, cared for it honestly enough, it became part of what you were, and what you were became part of it. He was right about that. There's a corner of the eastern pasture where the land dips slightly, barely noticeable unless you've walked it 1,000 times, and in the mornings, when the light comes in low from the southeast, the dew sits in that hollow longer than anywhere else on the property. My father used to take his coffee out there some mornings and just stand, not doing anything, just standing in that particular light, in that particular hollow, with the cattle moving slowly in the background. I still do that sometimes. I thought about it during those 6 days with the barrier across my driveway. Not with anger exactly, more with a kind of clarity that inconvenience sometimes brings. This land had survived drought and debt and one genuinely catastrophic hailstorm and 11 years without the man who built it. It had outlasted every difficulty that had come at it from the outside. It would outlast a clipboard and a Facebook Live and 14 slides about rooster aggression. What bothered me, if I'm being precise about it, wasn't the barrier itself. It was the presumption behind it. The absolute, unexamined certainty that Karen Whitmore had the right to decide what belonged here and what didn't. That a neighborhood incorporated in 2021 could look at 51 years of someone else's life and family and work and declare it inconsistent with community standards. My father never asked anyone's permission to build what he built here. I wasn't about to start now. The rooster crowed at 5:47 every morning during those 6 days, without variation, without apology, the way it always had. And every morning I heard it from the shoulder of the road while I was unlocking the side gate, and every morning it sounded, to me, exactly like the right answer to every certified letter Karen Whitmore had ever sent. Thursday was coming. I was ready. Thursday came in hot and still, the way August evenings in Texas do, the kind of heat that doesn't apologize and doesn't move until it's ready. I ate an early dinner, changed into a clean shirt, put the brass key in my front pocket where I could feel the weight of it against my leg. Then I drove to the entrance of Sunset Hills and parked on the county road shoulder, engine off, windows down, and waited. 6 o'clock. The first cars started coming. Rush hour into Sunset Hills runs predictably, the same window every weekday, the same stream of SUVs and sedans turning off the county road and funneling through the single entrance. I'd watched it enough times from my own property to know the rhythm. By 6:15, the flow was steady. By 6:20, the gate was cycling open and closed every 40 seconds. At 6:28, I got out of my truck. I walked to the gate control panel, a standard residential access unit mounted on a steel post at the entrance of Parcel 7C, my parcel, and I inserted the brass key into the manual override lock on the side of the unit. I turned it once, clockwise. The gate stopped mid-cycle. The green indicator light went dark. The automated system disengaged. I stepped back, put my hands in my pockets, and waited. The car at the front of the line, a silver minivan, a woman I didn't recognize, pressed her key fob. Nothing happened. She pressed it again. The gate didn't move. She rolled down her window and looked at the panel with a particular expression of someone whose Tuesday through Friday routine has just stopped working without explanation. Behind her, a second car pulled up, then a third. By 6:35, there were 11 cars backed up onto the county road, hazard lights blinking in the early dusk like a very confused Christmas display. Drivers were getting out, walking to the panel, pressing the call button, getting no response, walking back to their cars, getting out again. At 6:40, a woman I recognized as Deborah, the one who had sent me the handwritten note, walked up to the panel, looked at it, looked at me standing 20 feet away on the shoulder, and stopped. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me for a moment, and something crossed her face that I can only describe as recognition. Not surprise exactly, but the expression of someone watching a thing they had expected arrive exactly on schedule. She walked back to her car. At 6:43, I heard the heels before I saw her. Karen Whitmore's white SUV had apparently been caught in the backup 3 cars deep, and she had abandoned it on the shoulder and was walking toward the entrance at a pace that communicated, with remarkable efficiency, that she believed the situation was a malfunction and she was the person qualified to fix it. She was dressed for the meeting. Blazer, the sunglasses pushed up on her head now that the sun was lower, the clipboard under her arm. She walked past 4 cars without acknowledging the drivers, went straight to the panel, and punched the reset button with the focused authority of someone who has reset this panel before. Nothing happened. She punched it again. Nothing. She looked at the key slot, the manual override I'd used, and I watched the moment she noticed it. A small hesitation. Her hand moved toward it, then stopped, because there was no key in it. And without a key, there was nothing to turn. She looked up, and she saw me. I was standing on the shoulder of the county road, maybe 30 feet away, hands in my pockets, watching her with the same energy I'd give a weather report, present, attentive, not particularly urgent about any of it. She stared at me for a second. Then she walked over, And I will give her this. She kept her voice controlled. Whatever she was feeling, she packaged it into something that was meant to sound authoritative. "Mr. Turner," she said, "this gate is HOA infrastructure. Whatever you think you're doing, it's installed on Parcel 7C, I said. She stopped. Parcel 7C, I continued, which I purchased 11 days ago. And per a 1978 access agreement between the original developer and my father, which has been on file with the county this entire time, the owner of that parcel holds exclusive operational control over gate access infrastructure installed on or adjacent to it. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a folded copy of the agreement. Dale had suggested I bring one and held it out to her. She didn't take it. Behind her, the line of cars had grown. I counted 19 now, backed out onto the county road, hazards blinking. Several more drivers had gotten out and were standing near their cars, watching. Greg, from the house closest to my fence line, was leaning against his hood with his arms crossed. Howard, the retired schoolteacher, was standing near the panel with his hands in his pockets, watching Karen with an expression I recognized as the one he'd probably used for 30 years on students who had argued with a grade they'd earned. "You can't," Karen started. "The agreement is recorded with the county," I said. "Dale Mercer, my attorney, sent a copy to your HOA board-certified mail 9 days ago. He sent a second copy to the gate installation company, who confirmed my operational rights in writing and provided the master key." I held up the brass key briefly, then put it back in my pocket. Karen looked at the key, looked at the agreement in my outstretched hand, looked at the line of cars behind her, looked at the residents standing outside their vehicles, watching, and for the first time in 6 months, she had nothing to write on her clipboard. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. In a normal conversation, 4 seconds is nothing. Standing at a blocked gate in front of 19 cars and a growing audience of your own neighbors, 4 seconds is a very long time. "I'd suggest calling your board attorney," I said quietly, "but my understanding is Dale already spoke with him this afternoon." He had. Dale had called Karen's HOA attorney at 2 p.m., walked him through both documents, and reported back to me in 3 words. He went quiet. Karen looked at me one more time. Then she turned and walked back toward her SUV without another word, heels on the asphalt, the clipboard still under her arm, the sunglasses still pushed up on her head, every resident in that backup line watching her go. I turned back to the gate panel, inserted the key, turned it counterclockwise. The green light came back on. The system re-engaged. The gate opened. The minivan at the front of the line pulled through slowly, the driver looking at me as she passed. I nodded. She gave a small, slightly bewildered wave. Car after car rolled through. Greg passed and lowered his window. "Jake," he said. "Greg," I said. He nodded once, the specific nod of a man who has just watched something he'd been waiting to see, and drove through. Howard was one of the last. He stopped his car even with where I was standing, rolled down the passenger window, and looked across at me. "That 1978 agreement," he said. "How long have you had it?" "Since my father filed it," I said. Howard looked at the gate, looked back at me. "And you waited," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Seemed like the right time," I said. He laughed, a short, genuine laugh, and drove through. The last car cleared the entrance at 7:04. I stood there for another minute in the quiet that followed, the county road empty now, the gate standing open, the evening light going gold across the cedar and limestone. Then I got in my truck and drove home. When you finally watch a thing correct itself, not violently, not with anger, just completely and in public, what's the feeling that comes after? Not triumph exactly, something quieter than that, something closer to, of course. Of course that's how it ended. The metal barrier across my driveway was gone by Saturday morning. I don't know exactly when it happened. I didn't watch, didn't ask, didn't need to know. I came out at 6:15 to feed the cattle, and it was simply gone. The concrete footings pulled and the ground smoothed over, as if it had never been there. The only evidence that remained was 2 faint marks in the gravel where the footings had sat, already starting to fill with dust. I drove my truck up the driveway for the first time in 6 days, parked in front of the barn, same spot I'd parked in for 20 years. Sat there for a minute with the engine off. The following Tuesday, a letter arrived from the Sunset Hills HOA, not certified, not from a law firm, just a standard envelope with a printed return address. Inside was a single-page HOA letterhead signed by Karen Whitmore and 2 board members. It acknowledged that the barrier installation had been placed in error on a parcel outside HOA jurisdiction and offered a formal apology for any inconvenience caused to adjacent property owners. The font was noticeably smaller than the original violation notices. I read it once, folded it, and put it in the manila folder with the 1978 agreement and the deed to Parcel 7C. Filed the folder back in the barn cabinet, 3rd drawer, where it had come from. Dale called that afternoon to confirm that the HOA attorney had formally withdrawn all outstanding compliance notices against my property. The fines, none of which I had ever paid, none of which had been legally enforceable, were voided. The Agricultural Compliance Initiative disappeared from the HOA bulletin board sometime that week without comment or announcement, the way things quietly vanish when nobody wants to be associated with them anymore. Karen Whitmore remained HOA president. I don't know what happened inside those 42 households after Thursday evening, whether there were conversations, whether her standing shifted, whether anyone brought up the 14-slide PowerPoint at a subsequent board meeting. That wasn't my business, and I didn't go looking for it. What I know is that the emails stopped, completely, immediately, without transition or explanation. The inbox that had collected certified notices about rooster vocalization and cattle sightlines and tractor aesthetics went quiet, and stayed quiet, the way things go quiet when there is nothing left to say. The ranch continued exactly as it always had. Cattle fed at 6:30. Fence checks on Mondays, tractor on Tuesday and Friday mornings. The old John Deere, loud as it ever was, running the same circuit along the western fence line it had run for 31 years without once consulting anyone's visual standards. And the rooster, still crowing at 5:47, give or take a minute, every single morning without fail, with the absolute confidence of a creature that has never once questioned whether it belongs where it stands. I hung the brass key on a hook by the kitchen door, not as a trophy, not as a warning, just a key on a hook, the way useful things get kept, within reach in case they're needed, which they probably won't be. My father used to say that the land doesn't argue, it doesn't negotiate, doesn't file complaints, doesn't post updates on a bulletin board. It just stays, does what it's always done. Outlasts the noise. He was right about that, too. Some mornings I still take my coffee out to the eastern pasture, to that low corner where the dew sits longest in the early light, and I just stand there for a while, not doing anything particular, just standing in that hollow with the cattle moving slowly behind me and the light coming in low from the southeast, the way it always has, the way it will, long after everyone involved in this particular chapter has moved on to whatever comes next. It's quiet out there, the good kind of quiet, earned, settled, uncontested. The rooster crows, the cattle move, the tractor starts up on Tuesday morning, same as always. And if you drive past Sunset Hills on your way into Austin and glance at the entrance, you'll see a gate that opens and closes on a regular schedule, exactly as it was designed to do, on land that belongs to a rancher named Jake Turner, per an agreement his father made in 1978, which was there the whole time, waiting patiently in a kitchen drawer for someone to give it a reason to matter. The next time someone with a clipboard and a little borrowed power tells you that something you've built, something you've earned, maintained, and never abandoned, no longer belongs where it stands, ask yourself, what do they know about what was here before they arrived? And what are they missing about what will still be here long after they're gone?